Character animation is one of the most important things in motion design industry, and facial animation is one of those subjects that sometimes it can be challenging. Hello and welcome to this course. In this course, you will learn how to create a head rig using Duik Bassel connectors. Duik is a free and massive plugin for character animation, and in this course, we will use connectors in order to create a head rig. At first, we will dive through the fundamentals. We will learn how to use the connectors with basic shapes. Then we slowly start to prepare our character. You will learn how to use nulls in order to make a perfect rig. And then we will learn how we can create a smooth pupil animation. And then how to create different eye shapes. And lastly, how to use arcs in order to have a realistic animation. And in this course, we also use tons of effects and presets in order to have a better animation. For the class projects, students have access to 3 types of files, from easy to hard, which they can work and challenge themselves. Once again, welcome, let's start. Okay, so this is the introductory part of Duik Bassel. In this video, we are going to cover everything you need to know in order to use this plugin for this course. So after you install Duik Bassel, in order to open the script, you need to go into Window panel and then select Duik Bassel in here. When you open Duik Bassel for the first time, you will have a screen much or less like mine. But if your screen is different from what I have in here, just go towards the setting icon, and in here make sure you set your user interface panel on standard. If it's on the rookie, you can access to the connectors. Now if we go towards the rigging section, the first part is the structures, which you can use in order to rig a character, and we don't really need them for this course. But the second menu is links and constraints, and in this section we have connectors, which we'll use for this course. Now if I click on it, I can have access to 3 types of connectors. These connectors are basically the same as the ones you have on your effects tab. Let me select the layer first, and in effect menu, let's select expression controls. As you see, you have the angle control, slider control, which they are the same as the ones you have on Duik Bassel. On this course, we only use 2-dimensional and 4-dimensional slider, and we will not use the angle control. So to start, let's click on a 2-dimensional slider in order to create one. Okay, right now, as you see, you have a slider which you can control it by moving it. But right now, if I change it, nothing will happen because we didn't connect anything into it. Right now, if I go towards the effects and preset tab, and if I navigate through the handle section, as you see, we have a color, size, opacity. If I change the size, as you see, it increases the button size. Or I can change the color to whatever I like. For example, I'm just going to set it on blue. And in slider section, we can increase and decrease the slider length. So let's make it bigger to see it better. And to move the slider, select the CPG slider and then you can move it. But if you select the slider, you cannot move it. So let's move it in here. So when do you use 2-dimensional slider? Well, the answer is simple. You use the slider when you want to connect a 2-dimensional property into it. For example, let's press S on this square and set a keyframe for a scale property. Now let's reduce its size to 0, and on 8th frame forward, let's move towards 100. But okay, first let's put its anchor points on the middle. I'm gonna use mute, which I'm gonna explain it to you later on. Now I want to connect these properties to my slider. To do so, just select them and click on Connect to Properties. Now, as you see, you can change the slider and the square scale changes from 0 to 100. And you can set the keyframes on position in order to animate the slider. One important thing you need to know is that timing will impact these sliders. For example, if I change the original keyframes into Easy Ease, as you see, the animation becomes much realistic. And even the exact opposite things works as well. So if I change the slider, as you see, it'll have a huge impact. Or for example, increasing the distance also can have an impact. Or turning them into a toggle hold keyframe by right-clicking on keyframes. So this is a two-dimensional slider and it's pretty easy to use, and we will use it quite often in this course. Now let's remove the keyframes and talk about four-dimensional slider. Now let's move it in here so we can see it better. And let's make it a bit more visible. Usually you use these sliders for controlling the X and Y axis for your position value. So press P to bring up position for your square. The first thing you need to do is that you need to right click on position and select the separate dimensions. In order to make the connector work, you will need 3 keyframes for each axis. So I'm just going to set a keyframe on X position, then I'm going to move 1 frame forward, and I put another keyframe, and 1 frame forward I put the last one. The first one, you can use it to move your layer towards the left, and it is for the left side of your slider. So let's move it towards the left side. On the middle one, it should stay in the middle, and on the third one, you should move your layer towards right. Now, in order to connect them, select your keyframes, and since we are working on X position, set the axis on X, and we are working on the value. And then lastly, click on Connect to Properties. Now, as you see, the horizontal axis, which is for the X value, works perfectly, but the vertical axis doesn't. Something to mention that changing the slider size again have a huge impact on your animation. The smaller or bigger can have a huge impact. Now, to do the Y value, you need to do the same step. On the first Y keyframe, you need to move it up. So I'm gonna press my upper arrow key 5 times and ignore the mid one, and on the last one, move the slider down. Keep in mind that the distance shouldn't be always 1 keyframe. You can extend it, but you will need 3 keyframes for it. So basically a 4-dimensional slider is made from 2 2-dimensional sliders. So now let's connect it. Now let's reduce the quality to quarters so we can work better. Now, as you see, it works perfectly. Okay, this is what you need to know about the sliders for this course. And there are a couple of more tips that you will learn during the course. But right now, let's remove the keyframes and let's talk about principles of animations and view expressions. I have already explained everything in my Principle of Animation in Action course, and I highly encourage you to watch the first video on that course in order to learn principles and mute expression. But one expression that you see I use quite often in this course is bounce expression, and I use it to add follow through and overlapping action. So let's animate a simple position. And then let's add a bounce expression to it like this. And again, I completely covered these expressions and principles on Principles of Animation in Action, but if I want to explain them again, it will take another 30 minutes. But basically, this is the expression which I'm going to put it on the class projects, but I still again highly recommend you to watch the first 10 minutes of the Principles of Animation in Action course. So with this knowledge, let's start. Alright, so we are inside of After Effects, and in this video we are going to create a rig where we can animate our character later on. So the first thing I'm going to do is that I'm going to check my composition dimensions. Right now it seems too small. To do so, I can press Ctrl plus K, or I can right click in here and then I click on composition settings. Let's set the duration on 5 seconds. And let's set the width and height into 1920 by 1080. And let's leave the frame rate on 24. And now let's rasterize our layers. Now, what we need to do is that we need to reorganize our layers. We can do that by color labeling them, and also we are going to parent the related parts. Let's select cheek, mouth, hair, and hat. And let's set them on the dark green. Now, let's set the yellow for our face. Let's change our ear colors. And same goes for our pupils. Now let's change our eyes color and let's move the left one beneath so they stack in order. Perfect. Now we need to make our rig in order to make our job easier later on when we use connectors. Well, it's for the best if we parent the layers into a null and then we connect those nulls into a connector. So I am going to create one null that is corresponds for our eyes. To do so, right click on empty space in your layer panel and then create a null object. Now let's rename it into eye movement. And then let's move our null into its right position. Let's move its anchor point into middle, and then let's press S to reveal scale property and reduce its size. And let's move the null between our eyes. And let's parent our eyeballs into the null. Now, if I move the eyes, as you see, they move, but they need to move inside the eyeball. To do so, I'm going to select this layer and I'm going to duplicate it. And let's rename it to animate. And I move it above the right eyeball, and at the end, let's set the matte on alpha. And by any chance, if you are missing the track matte panel, make sure you have these two options set on blue. And let's do this step for our left eye as well. But before we do that, let's move our null above. Now, as you see, it moves correctly. Now it's time to create a null which is corresponds for our facial movement. Let's create a null by pressing Ctrl plus Alt plus Shift plus Y together this time. Let's change its color and make it smaller and move it in the middle as well. Now let's call it the facial movement. Now let's parent our facial parts into this null. Okay, we finished our rig in this lesson. Now let's take a short break and we move to the next lesson. Okay, now in this video we are going to connect our eyes into a connector. So let's select the eye null and press P to bring up position. Now let's zoom in a bit and set a keyframe. Now one frame forward, another one, and another one on the next frame. Right click on it and select separate dimensions. On X parameter for the first keyframe, move the eyes to the left. Ignore the middle one and move the eyes towards the right for the third keyframe. Go into connectors section, create a 4-dimensional slider. Okay, let's create a background for our animation first. Right now the connectors color overlapping with our background. Let's press Ctrl plus Y to create a solid layer. Give it a gray color and move it down like so. Now select the CBG layer and move it in here. Now select the X parameters and then click on Connect to Properties. Okay, everything is good. Now let's do the same step for our Y parameter. On the first keyframe, move the eyes up. And on the last one, move it down. Okay, select them, change the axis to Y and connect them. Okay, let's take a look. Okay, let's lock our background in order to prevent it from moving. Now let's just test it. Alright, everything is good. Let's rename it to eye movement. And same as CVG1. Now let's go towards the text menu and add a name for it. Now let's parent the text into CBG, so when we move the connector, the text moves along with it as well. Okay, now let's lock the layer. And since we have too many layers, we need to hide some of our unnecessary layers. So I'm gonna hide the text for now. Now let's close our keyframes by pressing U, and now let's go towards the facial movement node and press P to bring up position. Create two keyframes. On the first one, move the facial into left. But I think it's for the best if we remove the hairs from the facial part, since we can animate it later on individually for more accurate animation. Alright, now let's move our facial parts to left. And on the second keyframe, let's move the node to right. Now let's add a two-dimensional slider and connect them. Now let's move it beneath the eye movement and let's add a name for it. And now let's adjust its position. And now let's go towards the slider settings and we need to increase its size. And now let's rename them. And now let's parent them, and lastly let's try them. Alright, now let's add a blink for our character. Usually the way I'm going to animate is I'm going to parent the scale value for each related layer into one. So I control everything with one parameter. So let me show you by an example. Let's bring up a scale value for right eyeball and right eye by pressing S. Remove the chain option. And then press Alt and click on the stopwatch to create the expression in here. Now let's use this peak whip in order to connect the scale property from the right eyeball into eye matte 2. Let's repeat this step for our layers. Now as you see, if I change the eye matte 2, entire right eye changes as well. So this is a pretty good trick and it saves you a lot of time. And at the same time you have a lot of control over your layers. Okay, now let's do this step for the left eye. Okay, now everything is good. Now let's close panels and let's select the eye matte 2. Let's press S to bring up a scale and set a keyframe for it. Okay, now let's create a two-dimensional slider again. Now let's connect the scale property into it. Now let's test our connectors to see if they work properly. Now as you see, they're working just fine. Now let's move the connector in here and let's add a blink text for it. And now let's rename the sliders as well. And lastly, let's parent and hide them. Okay, here's our eyes. Let's move towards the next video. Okay, now we are on one of the most exciting parts of this course. It's time to create our pupil animation. So the first thing I'm going to do is that I will fix the anchor points position for each pupil. Okay, now let's select them. Press P and R to bring up position and rotation. Now set a keyframe. Move them at 6 frames. Now rotate the first one. Rotate -45 degrees and move it a bit down. Now let's do this step for the second and the third pupil. Rotate them and adjust them till they match the first pupil. Okay, let's play. We have a small problem in here, and that is because the rotation property is set for both keyframes. Let's fix it. Now let's extend the distance between the keyframes in order to get a smoother animation. Alright, now let's add a follow through and overlapping action. Let's add the expression first. And now let's create an overlapping action by offsetting the keyframes. Okay, now there is one major problem when it comes to connecting pupils into connectors, and it is we already added bounce expression to our pupils, and if I want to connect them, Duik itself gonna override its own expressions into my bounce expression, and that's not what we want, because it will be really challenging to create a smooth follow through and overlapping action using the connectors later on. Now, let me show you by example. As you see, I don't have the follow through action anymore. So let's delete the slider first. Now, to fix this problem, let's recompose the left pupils. You can do that by pressing Ctrl plus Shift plus C. And now let's right click on it and select Enable Time Remapping. Time remapping allows you to speed up or slow down your animation, and we will use this trick to connect our layers into a connector. Now let's connect it. Now there is one small problem, and it's when I add a keyframe, as you see, I still don't get my follow through and overlapping action. Even if I increase distance, still I get a fast and unrealistic animation. To fix this issue, you can set the maximum parameter in connection mode into a higher number. For example, if I set it on 800, as you see, it looks much better. But now if I increase it into, for example, 2000 and 100, as you see, it becomes really slow. Okay, now let's delete everything because we will animate both pupils with one connector in a few minutes. Okay, let's select our right pupils. Let's set a keyframe on position and rotation. And now let's press U on one of the left pupils and use it as a reference. Now let's set a keyframe on it. Okay, we didn't fix our anchor points and we need to fix it now. So let's go towards mute and adjust them. Now let's set the rotation on 45 degrees. And now in order to make both pupils on the same line, we can use a ruler. Press Ctrl+R to bring up ruler and adjust the pupils. Okay, now let's add a follow through and overlapping action again. And now let's add them into a connector. The first step is we are going to pre-compose the pupils by pressing Ctrl+Shift+C and then right click on it and then select enable time remapping. Now let's create a slider and connect the pupils into it. Now let's change the maximum connection mode into 800 and now let's test it. Okay, everything is good. Now let's close the ruler and move the slider down. And in here, let's rename them and add a text for it. Now let's text the connectors. Okay, we have a grammar mistake in here, and let's fix it. Pardon me for that. Now let's add our pupils into our facial node. Okay, everything is set. In this video, we are going to create what I like to call a smiley eye for our character. Right now, if I change the bling slider towards right, and when bling slider reaches at the end, I want to create a smiley eye. Now, to do it, I will go towards the ellipse tool and I will create a circle like this. Now, let's move the anchor points towards the middle. And now let's add a trim path for it. Now let's set the end value to 75, and now let's set the start value to 25 as well. And now let's round the edges. I'm using Bot Capper tool, which is completely free, and I highly recommend you to download that plugin as well. Now let's press S to reveal the scale property, and now let's reduce its size. Now let's move it in middle. And now let's move our shape layer in the middle of our face. And let's go now towards the content menu. And now let's duplicate the ellipse one. And now let's move towards the right side. Now let's decrease the stroke size a bit. And now let's just rename it to a smiley eye. And now let's go towards the connectors and let's create a two-dimensional slider. Now let's press T to bring up opacity, and now let's set it on 0, set a keyframe on it, and 1 frame forward, set the opacity on 100. Now let's connect them. Okay, we really don't want to have an animation between 0 to 100. So let's turn keyframes into hold by right clicking on them. Okay, let's rename the sliders. And let's add a text for it. And now let's parent it. And lastly, let's lock the text layer. Alright, all done. In this video, we are going to work on our pupils a bit more. So right now, if I close all of the layers by pressing U, and if I reveal the position value for the face, as you see, there are parts of the characters that needs to be fixed. So let's parent them into face as well as facial node. Alright, now if I change the pupil slider, as you see it works, but it doesn't disappear. So we need to create a connector which is corresponds for our opacity. And it becomes really handy when we want to change our blink into a smiley eye. So let's set a keyframe on opacity for pupils. Right click on keyframes and then select toggle hold keyframe. And now let's create a connector for it. Let's rename it to pupil opacity. Let's move it in here, and then let's add a text for it. Okay, now for the last part, before we start animating, let's hide the unnecessary layers. So I'm just gonna quickly do that. We only need sliders as well as ears and the parts that needs to be animated later on. So let's just quickly do that. Okay, we are ready for animating. Alright, now it's time to create our animation. In this video, I'm going to create a basic head movement, as well as I will add blink using connectors when our character is in the middle. Let's set the time indicator on 1 second, and let's press P to bring up position. Right click on it and click on separate dimensions. Set a keyframe on Y value. Go 2 frames forward, set another one. Move 4 frames forward and set another one. Move it 1 frame back and then on 8th frame put another keyframe. On the second keyframe, add an anticipation by moving the character up. Go towards the next keyframe and move the character down. Now select keyframes and press F9 to easy ease them. Good. Now set a keyframe on X position when the character starts anticipating its movement, and then on the last Y keyframe, move the character to the left in a way we will stimulate an arc. Now easy ease the keyframes. And now move towards 2 seconds and almost half and copy paste some keyframes. Delete keyframes on X value. Copy the last one and paste it in here. And move time indicator in here and move the character towards the right. Okay, let's watch. Now let's do the same step and bring back our character to its original position for a perfect loop. Let's hit spacebar to preview. Alright, so we have our basic head movement. Okay, now let's add a blink. Press P on C blink to reveal position value. Move the slider towards right. Hide pupil opacity by pressing P and then move the slider towards the left. And now reveal the smiley eye using the position value as well. Okay, let's preview. Alright, we have a small issue in here, and it's we forgot to parent the smiley eye to the face, and we will do it later on. But first, let's create a blink for our character. Let's move our keyframes a bit back. Okay, now it's time to animate the blink, but let's delete this keyframe first, and let's move the slider and animate it. Alright, looks good. Now let's parent the smiley eye to the facial node, and now let's complete our blink by bringing back the slider into their original positions. Okay, it is good, but now let's animate the pupils. Let's adjust the keyframes, and almost in here, let's bring the pupil slider to the right. And let's extend it a bit. Alright, this looks good. Okay, so far we have this animation. Let's watch it. And now it's time to animate the left turn for our character. To do it, let's move around one frame and let's close up keyframes. Now let's bring up face and use its keyframe as a reference. Now let's bring up eye movement, and when the arc finishes, let's move the eyes towards the left, and also let's move the facial parts to the left as well. And now it's time to animate the hair, but first we are missing the hair, so let's bring them by unshining the layers. And now let's set a keyframe on position for it. And now let's move it to the left. And now let's add a bit rotation to it. But first let's go towards the mute and move its anchor points down. And now let's create a bit overlapping by going in middle and change the rotation. Okay, now let's animate the hat. So let's add a warp effect now. Let's set the anchor point on middle. Change the warp style to bulge. And now set the warp axis on vertical. Okay. Now let's add a grow bound effect and CC Bandit effect now. Okay, now let's fix the beginning and the end. And now let's set a keyframe on it. Okay, now what we need to do is that we need to adjust the position. To do that, bring up the position value on the hat and set a keyframe on it. You can still exaggerate it or rotate it back a bit more, but I'm happy with the way that it looks now. So I'm just gonna easy keyframes, and now let's add a bit overlapping action into it. It looks good. Now it's time to animate the ears. So when a person or a character turns into left, you're not going to see its left ears and vice versa. So now we'll fix the ears anchor points first. And now let's bring up rotation by pressing R, and let's set a keyframe on it. And now in here, let's move the left ear in a way in order to hide it. And now let's push the right ears back. Okay, let's fix the cheek issue in here. So let's select it, bring up position for it, and then adjust its position. And lastly, let's add a follow through expression. But first let's try the layers. Now ease them, apply bounce expression, and turn the end keyframes into lean by holding Ctrl and left click on it. And also let's do this step for the hair and hat as well. Okay, now let's go towards the right side. So far we have this animation, and now, but let's decrease the pen radius a bit. I think it's a little bit too big. Okay, this seems good. Now let's make our right turn. Let's bring up eye movement and let's set a keyframe on it, as well as the facial movement. And let's move the keyframes in here, and let's move the character towards right. Same as the eyes. Okay, now let's set a keyframe for the hair animation. And now let's rotate it by -12 degree this time, and as well as let's move it in here. Okay, now let's adjust the hat. To do so, let's create keyframes on hat. And now let's set the bend on the CC bend depth effect on -17 and move it back. Okay, now let's watch. And now let's add a bit follow through and overlapping action by offsetting the keyframes. Okay, this seems good. Now let's close the layers and let's start animating the ears. Let's press U to bring up keyframes, and now let's set a keyframe on them. Now let's bring back the left ears into their original positions, as well as we move the right ears like this. But now let's adjust the left ears a bit. Okay, let's correct our keyframes in order to make our bounce expression work. Okay, now we need to fix the cheek, so let's bring it up back and let's adjust its position like so. And now let's bring back everything into its original position for a perfect look. So copy first keyframe and paste them in here. Let's bring back our facial nose into middle as well. So let's fast forward and do it really quick. Alright, all done. And in this video we are going to work on our animation as well as we work on stylization a bit. So far we have this animation. The first thing I'm going to do is that I'm going to readjust the keyframes in order to get a smoother animation. Let's select the smiley eye, press U to reveal the keyframes, and let's reveal all other properties as well. Now let's put these keyframes back. Okay, now let's cut the end of our animation, same as the beginning of it. And now let's watch. And now let's trim it. Okay, let's unlock these layers. And now let's make them as a guide layer in order to prevent them from rendering. And now let's select all of our layers and pre-compose them by pressing Ctrl plus Shift plus C. And now let's create a new composition by pressing Ctrl plus N and drag our head into it. Now let's talk a bit around frame rate and how it can impact your animation. Timing is one of the key concepts in animation, and in order to master it you need to understand frame rates. Well, in old times animators usually drew by paper and pencil. They started to draw on each paper and lastly they moved the papers in order to get an animation. Each frame is a drawing. For example, when a composition is set on 20 frames per second, it means it contains 24 drawings for 1 second. And the more frame rate you have, the smoother animation becomes. So, for example, let's add a post-rise time effect. Post-rise times effect can help you to change your frame rates at any time you want. Now, as you see, it is set on 24 frames per second because my composition was set on 24 frames. And this is the best frame rate for a smooth animation. Now, if I want to create a cartoony animation, we can set that on 50 frames per second. And to add a bit more hand-drawn style, we can add a turbulent displace effect to it. You can check the create a pencil drawn animation course for that. Now let's set the amount on 2 and the size on 10. And now let's hold Alt and click on stopwatch. And now let's write time multiplied by 250. And now let's duplicate it one more time. And let's set the amount on 10 and the size on 4. Now let's play. As you see, it looks more cartoony. Now if I change the frame rate into 30, it becomes really smooth and fast. Let's watch. And again, now if I change it into an 8-bit animation, look. Alright, this is it.